In this video, I'm going to show you how to fill out the Command Worksheet. This is a kind of a technical design document. What we're going to do is take the expanded plot worksheet, and then we're going to say, okay, when the player does any of these actions, what changes in the game? And we're looking at, do descriptions of objects change? Do locations of objects change? Do room connections change? So that and what messages get printed out. So we're trying to now take that kind of high level idea, and now we're going to try to make it sort of spell it out in technical steps that we'll be able to then code. So where do we get the commands? Well, that's going to come from the expanded plot worksheet. So let's go take a look at Heinlein Station here. So here I'm going to do a sample command worksheet for the space station game, and just sort of and complete that so you can see how that process would work. So when the game starts, the player has to read the note. Read is not a built-in verb, so I'm going to have to add read as a verb to the game. And then when the player has to read the note or reads the note, what's going to happen? Well, we'll just print a message, saying how you were abandoned, on the space station, how you were left behind. How about that? Because now I don't have to spell abandoned. All right, there we go. All right, so that's the only thing that happens when you read the note. It just prints out that message. Now there's an airlock, right? And there's a button in the airlock, and when we push the button, the airlock will open or close. So now we have to get into some scenario of, okay, if the airlock's open, this is going to happen. If the airlock's closed, this is going to happen. So rather than watch me type this all in, I think I'll probably just cut and paste it. Let's paste. There we go. So what we're going to say is, if airlock 1 is closed, print opening airlock, then connect airlock 1 west to the lunar surface, right? The lunar surface is another room in the game, and then block the way east, right? So the only one door out of the airlock is ever going to be open at any given time, and when we push the button, we're changing which rooms the airlock is connected to. So if the airlock's closed, we're going to print opening the airlock, and then open the airlock to the outside and close the inner door. And if the airlock was already open, then we do the opposite. We're going to print closing the airlock, then connect the airlock east east to the corridor, and then block the way west. So we are basically opening up one door, closing the other door. And then airlock 2, that's really just kind of the same thing. It's just a mirror image. So let's paste that in, right? So what we're putting in here is what descriptions of things change. In this case, no. But our message is being printed out. Yeah, we're printing out that we're opening the airlock or closing the airlock. And our room connections change? Yes. So that's what we're putting in. And apparently, how did I get weast as a verb? Weast is not a verb. Okay. West to the science station and block the way east. There we go. Okay. All right. Now, when the player is in the science station, well, they have to find the salt, right? The jar, the cube in the jar. But that's all. That behavior is all built in. You can have containers that can be opened and closed, and you can put things in containers. You don't have to special code that. You don't have to special code opening and closing objects like the dryer, examining the underwear that's got the secret code written on it. That doesn't have to be special cased, right? Because we're going to be able to put descriptions on objects, so we don't have to do any of that. But what we are going to have to do is eventually the player will get back to the command center, command station, and they're going to run into the slug. Okay, so how does the slug get into the game? Well, let's scroll down here to the bottom, and there's a section for events and environmental rules. So basically what's going to happen is when the player reaches the science center, if the slug hasn't been put into the game yet, now we put the slug into the game. So that's going to be a rule. It's not something that the player is going to type. That happens when the player is going to reach a certain point in the game. When the player gets to the corridor in the science station, we say, okay, if the slug hasn't been encountered yet, we're going to put the slug in the corridor over in the command center. So what would that look like? So we'll say, when the player is in the corridor in the science station, if the slug, okay, now this is interesting. Where is the slug? If the slug doesn't start in the world, where is the slug? I mean, the slug's in the game somewhere, but we don't see it. And that kind of place where things exist, that storage closet where we keep things until we need them, is called off screen. So we'll say if the slug is off screen and hasn't been killed yet, is that right? Yes, that is correct. And the slug hasn't been killed yet. Put the giant space slug in the corridor in the command center. There we go. So, and print the message, intruder alert. I don't know what it actually says. I think it says unauthorized access to command station. So I'm not going to type out the whole thing. So this is a rule in the game. When the player gets to the science station corridor, if we haven't killed the slug yet and the slug is off screen, now we're going to put the slug in the corridor over back in the command center and then print this message, intruder alert. And that's how the player is kind of, oh, wait, hang on, something's going on. So that's a rule. And that's how the slug is going to get into that corridor where the player is going to be able to throw the salt at it. So what happens when the player throws the salt at the slug? Well, we're going to print a message about the slug exploding. And what happens to the salt or the cube? It's the small white cube. That's what the salt is. They're the same thing. What happens to that object? Well, that object's gone from the world. It doesn't exist anymore. So we're going to move it off screen. Move the small white cube, and that's the salt, right? We're going to move the salt off screen. And the slug has been killed, right? The slug is gone. Move the slug, the giant space slug, off screen. Because the slug is gone now. It's exploded. And then maybe add 20 to the score. I don't know how many points the player actually gets to the score. Now, we have to keep track of whether the player's killed the slug or not. And the way we keep track of has the player done something or not done something is by using a variable. You can think of a variable as just a chunk of the computer's memory where we're going to store a number. And we're going to say, okay, maybe 0 means that the slug has not been killed. 1 indicates that the slug has been killed. That's how we're going to track whether the slug has been killed or not. There's also an interesting little thing here. The salt starts in the jar and moves off screen when we destroy it. So we could have kind of used the location of the salt to check if the slug has been killed. But I'm just going to say set a variable indicating the slug has been killed. So that's what's going to happen. So when we throw the salt at the slug, we'll print a message that it explodes. We'll move the cube, the salt, off screen. It's gone from the world now. We'll move the giant space slug off screen. We'll add 20 to the score. And then we'll set our variable indicating that the slug is going to be has been killed. And that's so the slug doesn't reappear in the world later if we go back to the science station. All right. Now notice here I've got the same command written out a whole bunch of ways. all of these are synonyms, right? This is going to get turned into a function, and these are going to be commands that the player could type that will call this same function. So any of the player types any of these things, it's going to result in this code, this function being run. All right. So now what else? What else have we got? Okay, so there's the putting the COM board in the slot. The player has to put the COM board in the slot to use the radio. And what happens when we put the COM board in the slot? Well, we're going to print out a message that, you know, maybe the board snaps neatly into place. Snaps into place. And now let's put the board actually in the slot. We're going to move the board to the slot, or into the slot. Right, so we're going to move this object to be into that object, and then maybe we print a message. The radio, the radio beeps, and now that's the indicator that something has changed in the radio. The radio beeps, and maybe add 10 to the score. I don't know what we really add, and I think that is it. So again, what are we doing here? We're printing out messages. We are changing the location of objects, and we're changing the variables that are used to store the state of our game. Okay, so now let's look at use radio command right here that the player is going to type, because when they examine the radio, it says there's a little sticker that says type use radio to use the radio. All right, so again, this is what happens depends on the state of the game, right? So if the COM board is in the slot, the radio has been repaired, so the radio will work. If the board isn't in the slot, the radio doesn't work. So if this is true, we're going to handle it this way. If this is not true, we'll handle it a different way. So what happens when the player types use radio? We'll say, well, if the COM board is in the slot, then what happens? And I'll just kind of write this out, like this, maybe using like Python notation. Print. Okay, so what if then we win, right? Print the victory message. Print the victory message. Set the score to 100. It's because the player's won now. And then if the COM board wasn't in the slot, well, then the radio doesn't. Oh, we actually know what we need to do is now we need to ask for the code. Put the COM board in the slot. That's right. Okay. Ask for the code. Okay. If the code is correct, then we're going to say, okay, print the victory message and set the score to 100. If the code was not correct, then what are we going to do? We'll say, print authorization error or something. All right, so this is if the COM board's in the slot, ask for the code. If the code's correct, print the victory message and set the score to 100. If the player enters the wrong code, print authorization error. All right, now, what happens if they try to use the radio and the COM board wasn't in the slot? If the COM board is not in the slot, then I'm going to print, beep COM board failure. I'm going to print this message that, hey, there's something wrong with the COM board, right? And again, that's a tip to the player. Hey, you've got to go figure out how to get the radio to work. All right, so that's it, I think, as far as commands go for this game. Now, what about other environmental rules? Well, we've got that thing about the player's not allowed to move past the slug. But there's another rule too. Oops, and then that is if the player is outside. Why am I bold here? If the player's outside the station, without wearing a spacesuit. Without a spacesuit on, being worn. I'll say being worn. The player dies. There we go. So that's a rule of the game, right? The player has to wear the spacesuit if they're outside of the space station. And then there's actually, all right, what else have we got? I know there's some other stuff here. So what happens? Okay, so we're going to mention the player dies. Okay, the player dies, maybe, and the game resets. Right. So now we're going to reset the game so the player can start over. Also, the player's not allowed to move past the slug. If the player is not allowed to move east if the slug is in the corridor. Is not allowed to move east into the turbo lift from the corridor. Junction if the slug is there. So the slug prevents the player from moving. There you go. That's a rule of the game. The player's not allowed to move east into the turbo lift if the slug is there. The slug will block the way. Okay, and I know there's one other thing here. Let's add, insert row below. The turbo lift. When the player enters the turbo lift, the room connections change. When the player is in the turbo lift, if the turbo lift is connected to the corridor, connected west to the corridor, connect it west to the command center, and print a message that the turbo lift rises, print a message that the turbo lift, so exciting, goes up. Okay, we'll do that. Change the description of the turbo lift. To mention that it leads west to the command center. Okay, now, because when you remember, when you play this game, print a message, you go into the turbo lift and it says the not so turbo lift slowly rises, and then the door opens, and now it opens to a different room. And then we have the opposite case when the player is in the turbo lift. If the turbo lift is connected west to the command center, connect it west to the corridor. Print a message that the turbo lift goes down, and then change the description of the turbo lift to mention that it leads west to the corridor. So we're changing room connections. So that's a pretty comprehensive write-up of that game. So again, what we've got here on the left is commands the player is going to type, and then on the right we have what changes in the game world. That's going to be our code, right? So that's what we're looking for here. When the player types this, what happens internally in the game? Do room connections change? Do we print out text? Do we change the score? Do we set variables? Then do we move objects in and out of the world? And that's really all there is in these games. There's not a lot of stuff that happens to objects other than changing properties on them. Like, are they locked? Are they closed? Are they open? Whatever. Are they being worn? Are they emitting light? We can change their descriptions. We can change how the rooms are connected. But just doing that small set of operations, we can create this really kind of neat little clockwork world that actually seems to behave consistently. So that's how you fill out the command sheet. What you're really going to do, again, is just take those. This is the stuff from your expanded walkthrough. And then what you're going to do is say, okay, what changes in your game? What changes in the world? When the player types this, what happens at a detailed level? And then also, what are some of the rules for your world? Like, the player's not allowed to move here if this case is true. Or if the player goes here and they're not wearing this, then they die, right? This is where the protective clothing puzzles come in. So there's an example of how you'd fill out this command worksheet. If you have questions on whether you're doing it right, just let me know. I'll be happy to help you. No one's born knowing how to do this. So, and don't be afraid to ask for help, because the more work you put on these documents, the easier your game coding is going to be. You're building a blueprint, and if that blueprint is good, building the game should be very, very easy.